You ever wanted to play a Dark Souls-esque role-playing game? Something placed within the Dark Souls universe, or perhaps just something with the feel, the atmosphere of the Ashen One and the trials the Ashen One must overcome. I have, at least for a while now, wanted to play in the melancholic and dangerous world that is the Dark Souls universe, or at least in a setting that adequately recreates the feel of being lost and alone in a world that is unfamiliar, yet terrifying. If you've ever been overcome by the urge to play in one of these settings and get to feel that around a role-playing table rather than sitting in front of a machine or device, perhaps creating a campaign, then this video is for you, and I will introduce some tools that you can use to create something similar. I use these rules to create a one-shot, short game that I ran for a small group of 6 players. In this video I'll cover the mechanics we created, the system we used, the setting, and how it actually ran. I will attempt to make timestamps for all of you so you can jump if there is something specific you're looking for, or if you're one of the players, if you simply wish to hear the story again, told from my perspective. I won't be telling it in detail because there were many conversations of the plight the characters found themselves in that I did not record well enough to adequately retell. For this game we're going to be using Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game, the 4th edition. As a system, it has the great strength that it's about people down on their luck overcoming great struggles, but it's also about facing risks other than simply combat and warfare. It's about sickness, disease, corruption. It's about losing yourself to the dark things. But even more than that, it's about persisting in the face of these dark things for as long as you can before you inevitably fall. I don't think you should use this concept and these rules for a long campaign. Rather, it stands well on its own as a one-shot, a short session where the players get introduced to their characters, experience the world, and then perish, falling to the decay within. The final scene especially, I think, is important for the atmosphere to be tied together, becoming a whole rather than a background element. For the characters we used the main character generation system from Warhammer Fantasy 4th edition. We applied 3,500 experience to each of the characters, and they were given mostly free choice of what to play and who their character was supposed to be. They were, however, given the advice that combat would be part of the game, so there would be reason to make characters who could hold up their own in a fight. I also suggested they took other skills that might not seem relevant, but could help them understand the world they found themselves in. Before going into the actual details of the game, I thought I would just talk about what Dark Souls is, or at least what this thing we're trying to recreate should feel like. Now, the main elements of Dark Souls appear to be that you are alone, at least somewhat alone. There are other beings there are NPCs you can talk to, and there are in fact other players who will leave markers and guides as to what you should do when you find yourself in strange areas. Nonetheless, the land around you is mostly empty, except for roving enemies, dangers, traps and enemies that you do best to avoid. Part of the game is also about dying and returning, dying and returning. This does not make for a good role-playing mechanic, because unlike a game, it does not rely on your skill of hand, your dexterity, to defeat the boss or the monster. Rather, it relies on the rolls of dice, and without a good mechanic to make sure that combat could be repeated without becoming boring, this is not something you'd wish to recreate in a role-playing system. Because of the one-shot nature of this game, I decided to remove the fate and resilience mechanics from Warhammer Fantasy roleplay. The resilience mechanic allows a character to automatically succeed on any roll with the best roll possible, and the fate mechanic allows the character to, if they would die, to not die or to prevent a single roll against them. However, Warhammer does rely on the sub-elements of the fate and resilience systems. Specifically, the fortune points and resolve are quite crucial for playing the game. Resolve because it helps you remove conditions and because it helps the character overcome fear and terror. Without this, they are likely to escape from encounters simply because they will run away at first sight. Anything scary will drive them to flee, and if their willpower is not good enough, they won't stand a chance to face up to whatever monster is in front of them. Fortune, on the other hand, is important because it allows the character to re-roll a failed attack or failed skill test. This is important because the skill rolls in Warhammer are not generally in the player's favor. In Warhammer, the player may have 30, 50 or even 70% chance, but in other games like the White Wolf systems, the player easily has 80% chance or at least 70% chance as a base. This means that Warhammer is quite difficult, and the player is going to need the fortune points or a similar reroll mechanic. In part because whether or not deciding to spend one of your limited rerolls is an important decision to make for the character. It's a situation where the player is forced to really consider if this moment is worth it. If this failed roll will cause them to die, and it forces them to think about what's currently happening. It forces the player to think about the game state and to think how it may change from their actions. And this is exactly what you want from a role-playing game. That's why I decided to make a mechanic called Divinity. It replaces the player's fate points without giving them fortune. Instead, they have 3 divinity points, each of them serving much like a fate point, except that they can only be used to avoid a scene completely if it causes death. If they die, their character will buckle over, and after the scene has passed, they will be restored to half health. This will allow them to participate in the one-shot even if they have been killed by an enemy early in the game, and they can do this 3 times. The mechanic is also conjoined with the aspect of corruption and losing oneself, in that the player must make 3 memories relevant to their character. I ask them to do this because Dark Souls is also a game and a setting where you don't generally know much. You must experience the world, and it must not happen through simple exposition. To do this, each player had to make 3 memories. The first being a person that mattered to their character. The second being a moment which gave them either great joy or great pain. The final memory, the third memory, was their goal or motivation that brought them onto the journey, the travel, the reason for being where they are right now, the reason for participating in this adventure, and the reason for pulling on even when the chips are down. When a player loses a divinity due to death or due to the second mechanic, the corruption mechanic, they will lose a memory as well. When a player loses a memory, you as the GM should ask them to briefly explain the memory, to describe it. It should be somewhat emotional, sad, melancholic perhaps, or maybe even it can be a satisfied, joyful description. As long as it ends on the note that the memory is now gone, the character has lost a bit of themselves. In doing so, they should think about how this changes their character and change their play accordingly. The player is free to choose which of the memories go first. Whatever seems the most relevant and whatever would give the best play, that is up to the player. I had a player who rolled the talent Pure Soul repeatedly, and I thought, well, while it doesn't make any sense as this system is because we'll not be using the regular corruption system, I suppose since he's rolled it multiple times, we will allow him to instead have an additional point of divinity. This gives him another memory, and he gets a core memory, a memory that is stronger than the others and which somehow makes him more human, more alive than the other characters. Furthermore, I granted each of the players a resolve point per point of divinity, so each would start out with 3, one would start out with 4, and whenever one of them would suffer death and spend a divinity, I would immediately restore them to the full now capacity for resolve. So once they dropped to 2 divinity, they would gain 2 resolve, and once they dropped to their final divinity, they would gain only 1, this being their final resolve before the final death. The second mechanic I introduced was the replacement for the corruption and the fortune mechanic. Players were permitted to take a reroll at any point in which they had failed a roll or failed an opposed test. Taking a reroll would however cause them to gain 1 corruption point. This would not go to the normal threshold, but instead whenever they took 1 corruption they would have to roll 1d10. If this roll was equal to or less than the amount of corruption accumulated, the character would immediately perish and lose 1 divinity, surging back to life at the expense of one of his most prized memories. This represents the character extending beyond their own abilities, sacrificing a bit of themselves in the effort to overcome an obstacle. Of course, this is a cruel mechanic, for the player may fail on the very first roll, losing a divinity by rolling a 1. Combined with this mechanic, I also believe you as the GM should use scenes that add corruption to the players. If they are not willing to use these rolls, and even if they are willing, there should come scenes that will torment their minds and ravage their bodies. These scenes should grant them 1 or maybe 2 corruption points. Maybe they even get to roll a willpower to resist, or a toughness if the corruption is physical in nature. This puts pressure on the mechanic because on one hand the player has the rerolls for a limited time, on the other hand it pushes them and becomes ever more dangerous to use these rerolls the further into the game they get, and the closer they get to situations where their death may ultimately prove permanent because they've run out of divinity. In your game you may decide to call it something else than divinity. In this case it is divinity because the setting we are playing in, even though the players do not know, relies on the concept that all mortal beings, all creatures and everything that exists in this world is bound to the pool of divinity, where the gods reside. This connection is what keeps them pure and what keeps the world afloat. This is a cyclic nature, where the world supports the foundation of the pool of divinity, empowering the gods, and in return the gods change and empower the world. This cycle, however, can be broken, because when divinity is lost from mortal beings, or when the mortal connection is lost from divine beings, a hole will erupt in the tapestry, causing corruption to flow into the world, until the ultimate destruction of everything will draw ever closer. This is a main concept of the game I ran. You are free to change it up, to use it differently, or to simply rename the mechanic. You could also call it humanity if you want to put it in the actual Dark Souls setting. It's very fitting that it should be called such, but I needed to place it in a different setting, because even though I love the Dark Souls aesthetics, I have not spent enough time poring over its lore, and I wished for something of my own, rather than to recreate an experience already seen in the game. Now, I think the mechanic should be enough to give you part of the atmosphere you're looking for. However, a different consideration regarding creating a game such as this is that you're going to have to probably go about your describing style in a different way than what you're used to. One aspect is that Dark Souls is about being in an unfamiliar world. This means that your descriptions must be vague, though they must still be adequate in the describing of setting scenes. You cannot describe a gatehouse in a way that does not make it appear as a gatehouse without confusing the players. But to simply say that there is a gatehouse is to sell the feeling short. A gatehouse is rarely simply a gatehouse, at least not if the battlements are crumbling, if the gate has long since rotted away, and there are remnants, skeletons climbing their way slowly towards the inside of the city, but who have stopped dead in their track, in the most literal sense. Of course, there are other elements as well. An aspect of Dark Souls is the fight between civilization and nature. There are many nature elements, and often you will find that civilization has defeated parts of nature, or that nature has begun reclaiming it. Because without people there is no one to maintain the area, and without anyone to maintain it, all civilization quickly crumbles to become lingering memories. It is also fine to take the descriptions rather slow, though you should not spend too much time on them, because at some point it will bore the players, as it always does. Feel free to use pauses to speak slowly and to speak in a quiet voice, of course making sure your players can hear you, but without giving everything a sense of urgency or epic scale. For while many things are of epic scale, between the empty courtyards and the long stretches of land where only the hollowed souls stir, where what passes for people now linger, there are creatures that seem hostile but do not react to their players passing, and there are NPCs who have lost themselves much the same way the players risk. There are NPCs who have fallen completely, and most important I think it is that you must consider all of the characters that appear are no longer human, in the sense that they will not behave as they should. Their greetings may be strange, they may describe things that they do not see, or things that they have seen in dreams. They might be unnaturally helpful even though they appear hostile. This may not be a trick at all. This is but a tool you use as a GM to create an eerie and strange world. Because the goal here is not to create realism. The goal is to create a world that is oddly familiar, but different. It is the uncanny valley where the players can recognize what they see, but they cannot inherently understand it. I would, however, suggest that when you describe something important but vague, you continue describing it until one of your players go, "Now I get it. Now I understand." Of course, not all players are vocal about this, but if you've GM'd for them before, you probably have a good idea of when they have caught on to what you've been telling, or when you need to not give them any more information. If you can, use strange and unfamiliar terms. Old language. You can of course explain to them what the words mean, but better to let them figure it out. They have access to computers. Let them look it up. Let them discover the meaning of the words, and if they are not willing to do so, let them ponder. What does inanity mean? What are the inane? All of these things should be enough to add to the setting you're trying to create. And I think that'll be my last pointers on how to describe and how to speak during this session. I mentioned not having an urgency to everything earlier. This is not to say that you shouldn't have any urgency at all. Because this is a one-shot, you are going to have to end the session. You are going to run out of time at some point, and before you run out of time, you must have reached the final scene. The final scene is a little bit different from the rest of the game, because in the final scene of this game that I ran, called Hollow Promises, we come to the realization that all of the motivations the characters had were promised to them by a mysterious stranger, one that they do not encounter as part of this scenario. He's a background character who is very important to the world they're playing in, and he is important to these characters, but they do not remember him. Rather, they remember only, or well, as it is revealed in the final scene, they come to realize that he had promised them things, while perhaps the promise he'd made was hollow, at least in the sense that they would receive something quite different from what they expected. He did deliver on his promise though, at least to some of them, those who stayed true and faithful. to the task he had appointed them. The final scene should feel like the ending scene of a western. It should feel like the moment where one of the gunmen has to make a choice, where there are multiple overlapping ethical choices or grey zones, where everyone is in doubt what to do next, perhaps in doubt what side they're on. There may be PvP at this point if you so desire. And if your players get upset at this PvP, perhaps it comes unexpected to some of them. Take a moment to calm them down and then tell them, this scene cannot be won. This scene is not a game. There is no winning move. This is not a game of chess. The only and probably final action they'll have to make is how their character dies. In this scene, divinity should not be used as previously described. In this scene, you should instead use divinity as a mechanic that, well, when a character has run out of divinity, they are truly dead. Depending on how much time you have left, you can either allow them to resurrect repeatedly as they try to overcome the final confrontation or each other, or you can have them finally fall to the decay within if they have suffered any divinity loss whatsoever. They are lost souls, and they will come to fear what they become, and they may realize that failure was inevitable, or success, depending on how you look at it. At least in my game, there was a sense that no matter what course of action they took, ultimately they could not win. They could not make the world a better place, but they could accomplish their own goals. That is what should inspire them to take action. The next step is actually going through how my game ran. For this, I'm going to use Roll20 as a visual aid. I'm going to show you some of the things we created, and I'm going to tell you a story. So if I still have your attention, sit a while and listen. The party comes awake outside of an old gate, battered and ruined, made from beige stone colored red, just like the sky in the desert beneath them. As they look up, trying to determine whether it is day or night, they realize that there is neither sun nor moon, only the red sky casting an eerie glow upon the world. To the north, the gatehouse presents an opening into an ancient and ruined city. The buildings have all crumbled, doors are long gone, and the windows are silent, except for the wind that occasionally howls through. To the south, they see a smaller settlement, barely larger than a village. The houses there are of the same make, equally broken, and it is a distance off. Just beyond this, there is a taunting tent of sorts. Cloth moves perilously in the wind. Beyond this, a ship, the sails tattered yet whole. The group looks around, recognizing one another, not through names and not through appearance, but seeing that they are there and they are similar. The knight, the nomad, the mage, and the crafter, formerly known as the servant. As they get up, they cannot help but question where they are and what has happened. But as they stay quiet and listen, they hear voices. A quiet whisper. "Kill us, kill us. Do not let us lie here. Kill us, please." Around them are the remains of someone who has died. Multiple skeletons lie just outside the gate. And it is in this place the lost have awoken. The skeletons seem to be the source of this whisper, and the knight, wielding his mace, goes to each in turn, smashing in their skull, until the last one whispers, "Thank you, thank you." Dissuaded by the ruined gate and the ominous battlements, the group decides to turn south for the docks. As they reach this town, they come upon a strange noise, which drives them to seek out the marketplace. It is a ticking laughter of sorts. It is high-pitched, and it kind of pains their ears. As they follow it, they arrive to something which may once have been a marketplace. There are 3 stalls, each of them covered in a living mass. The surface shifts ever so slightly as these creatures, whatever they are, move, and the knight steps close, lowering his mace onto the surface of them, and thousands of maggots, long-limbed with multiple legs, stretch from it to cling onto the mace, with mandibles digging into the steel, but their mandibles are no match for the steel of his mace, and they can cause it no damage. From beneath one of the stalls comes a voice. Trade! Whatever this creature is, they determine that they wish not to trade with it, and even as it appears, its horrifying eyes peeking over the edge of the counter, they withdraw. They have nothing they wish to trade with it, and dare not see what it hides in its stalls. Turning back towards the tent, they travel deeper into the harbour. They arrive at the docks, where the tent stands silently. Parts of it is in tatters. As they look upon it, they realize that unlike the rest of the city, it has not been here for as long. It is adorned in colours of yellow and black. The knight desperately seeks to remember, and the mage as well, but neither can. These colours are strangely familiar, but they cannot recognize them. It is as if a part of their being struggles against this desire to remember, making it impossible. Entering the tent, the knight finds a map leading from a land he presumes to be far away. There are multiple names there. He reads them: Askia, Merania, Return. But he recognizes them not. Except for Return, perhaps he called that home once. He does not quite remember. He sees that on the map is a line drawn from Return across the sea around a peninsula and down south, where it hits a desert just past the drawing of a sea monster. There the line hits land, hits a dog area, and then disappears into a blur of scratched out ink. Where perhaps a city may have been hidden underneath, there is only a weird, strangely reflective blot. He takes the map, handing it to the mage for safekeeping. Outside, the nomad and the crafter recognize that something is about to happen. As they look towards the ship, they see the hunter emerging. He is backtracking, and a large and brutal beast assaults him, throwing him backwards and onto the bridge. The hunter is knocked prone, wounded, and he believes alone. He has awoken on the ship, distant from everyone else, completely alone except for the monster that now seeks to destroy him. The others rush to his rescue. For a moment they hope the monster cannot reach shore, for it is a 7-meter jump and the thing looks cumbersome and heavy. It is as if a large humanoid had been wrapped in belts of flesh. It has multiple arms, each one a strange tentacle ending in a brutal blade, and it has a bald head with no eyes but a gaping jaw. Its mouth agape. It does not scream, but saliva runs ever and ever onto the ground below it. The monster makes landfall, and in rapid succession beats back the group. Multiple are wounded grievously. The knight and the crafter are thrown into the water. It presses on, reaches the hunter and destroys him. With a mighty heave of its arm, it crashes him into the ground, and his body is cleft in twain. It moves on to the nomad, breaking an arm and sliding into his leg, before turning upon the mage. It runs towards her, and for a moment it appears all hope is lost. For the knight has been drowning. In his armor, he is sunk to the very bottom of the ocean, and the crafter almost suffered the same fate. But in her last moment she has managed to reach the shore, grab onto part of the dock, and pull her way back onto land. As she gets back up, she swings her mighty hammer and crashes it into the skull of the beast. The knight returns as well, though he is not quite certain of how he survived. He brings his mace into the monster, and between the two of them it quickly falls and dies. It stops moving, and they attend their fallen comrades. As they stand there, something happens to the hunter, and his body collects itself. The blood starts pouring back into his veins, and he comes to with a cough and a horrible pain. They do not understand what they have just seen, but none of them remember anything. Only a few vague memories, and now the hunter remembers one less. They decide to investigate the ship, intending to use it as their way out of here. Perhaps they can escape this dark land. Perhaps there is a future elsewhere. As they investigate it, they come across a place where the ship has melded into a strange shape, from which the empty space creates a monster of bulky body and multiple arms, almost as if part of the ship had been conjoined, as if the crew had become the very monster they had just slain. In the captain's cabin they find a room drenched in a thick, oily substance. It is black and glistening, and it runs ever so slowly out the doorway after they have pushed it open. The mage recognizes that there is a skeleton trapped inside the wall, pointing with a single finger at those who trespass. And in that moment, everyone who looks into the room feels a slip of their soul fall away. They leave the ship, abandoning it, but not before the knight sets a light in the gunpowder room. It explodes, and they leave it. Heading back north towards the city, they come across again the ticking laughter. This time there's a voice and then a scream. They hurry. Perhaps it is another like them, since the hunter has now joined their party, and they come across the paladin engaged in a combat with the detester. This strange creature, the detester, seems infuriated by the paladin's adherence to the gods. It attacks using the swarm of maggots from these stalls to bind and entangle, to bite into her flesh and poison her. And it is only through their combined effort and a particularly brave stunt pulled by the hunter that they manage to bring it down. As the others keep it occupied, the hunter runs forward, slaps his saber into its skull, leaps onto it, and then jams his knife in where its ear should be. As it falls backward in pain and anger, his feet come upon its chest and he is carried into the air, when finally he pulls his dagger and saber to it. Each their own way, the skull shatters, and the being is broken and dead. The paladin reclaims her book from this creature that it had stolen from her. She explains that she has a name, and that she thinks her name is the one imprinted in the book. Unlike the others, she is Evelyn, but we will refer to her as the paladin. They search the stalls because this creature could have stolen more things, and they come upon a strange ring. As they look at this, they recognize it, for it belongs to someone, a man who may have led an expedition to a distant land down south. He seems very important, but they can't quite put a finger on it. His name may have been Gregor or some such, but they know not where he is now, and their memories do not match any of the characters present. Wounded by their combats, they decide to push north, but not before searching Sanctuary, where the paladin offers to heal her comrades. Unfortunately, searching Sanctuary proves difficult, for they are not alone, and every dark place they find has already been occupied by a slew of shadowy creatures. Instead of taking the fight, they push back into the desert, walking under the blistering red sky, and for a moment they feel that there is heat, and that the heat is about to kill them. But rather than kill them, it makes their blood boil. Veins open up and blood spills where they stand. The knight carries on. He knows they must continue. They cannot linger in the heat. But the elf, the paladin, is weakened, and she stops to save her comrades and herself. She manages to stop the bleeding on some, but not all, and she falls unconscious. The knight is forced to return and put his skills at healing to use, saving the paladin just barely. However, she remains unconscious, and they are forced to carry her. They reach the gatehouse, passing the skeletons they had broken before, and enter a place where a man sits patiently awaiting, while an ocean of the dark creatures stand looking in the direction of... It is no pyramid, but there is a structure. Massive, taller than anything else, dwarfing the very horizon. It is dotted with different towers, each of them a shadowy spire, going up hundreds of meters. They ask the man, and he explains that they are not the first to come here, and they would not be the first to die should they attempt to cross the sea. The mage has a magical artifact that she has already used once. It is an artifact that permits her to see the destination she so desires, at the cost of her own blood. It opens and reveals to her that somewhere beyond this sea of dark beings, beneath this pyramid of towers, is a throne, and that throne stands empty, and that is where she must go. She explains this to the others, but they can see no way of passing the creatures, and thus they rest for the night, hoping that the paladin will become conscious again come morning. During the night, the sky starts to change and shift. It grows green, still without sun, still without moon, and though it feels like it lasts for only 15 minutes, scores and scores of these night creatures arrive. These creatures the man they have just met called the Inane, who form the Sea of Inanity. As these creatures pass, some of the characters find themselves looking into their souls and into their hearts, and in doing so most of them come to cause another part of their soul to slip away as the beings stare back into them. The knight, however, sees something else, a being that is mighty and can provide the cure he so seeks. However, there is deceit in this promised cure. It is not true, it is not what he expected. There is something wrong, but he cannot fathom the extent of it. The night passes and the paladin comes awake. The nomad is still wounded, an arm broken and a leg battered. The paladin offers to heal by using the magic of her god Callistra. As she sits down to pray, the first of the inane starts to cock his head, then turns it to look over his shoulder. He recognizes the words of the gods, and it infuriates him. He is but the first of many, and soon they become a stampede as they rush upon the paladin. Only the paladin and the nomad do not manage to escape. The nomad with his bad leg manages to push his way out of the crowd, and dodges as another wave comes in. He barely manages to make it up onto the ramparts and step across a pathway laid out by someone who came before, which somehow leads across the sea of inanity, if you are brave enough to take it, and agile enough to stay on the planks as they groan beneath your weight. The elf, however, is surrounded. She is torn to pieces. She is killed. As she dies, she cannot help but question her god's power and intent. What god would let her faithful subject fall in a place like this? And she has a memory of when she was granted this book and when she joined this religious order. That memory fades from her, and she returns having been left behind. The others have arrived in the meantime to the entrance to this great pyramid of towers. This dark megastructure. Castle, if you will. In front of it lies a great beast, black in scale and a strange oil oozing from its pores. It does not seem inherently hostile, but as the night draws close it stirs, and he is forced to draw back. The mage sacrifices blood to question the eye again, and it explains that this being prevents those who are touched by divinity from entering. It is the guardian of the hollow. At this point the mage has unfortunately already suffered much. She has already lost some of the memories so dear to her, and as she realizes that she approaches true hollowing, she recognizes that if she should die once again, there will be no more divinity, and it will let her pass. She steps forward, draws forth a blade, and plunges it into her own throat. Blood runs from her throat. Death is imminent. She feels the memory slipping, but the knight runs to her side as the dragon looks upon them, and he closes the wound, and she barely survives. They exchange words, and as they do, the dragon begins to stir. It seems aggravated by their very presence. They are not hollow, not yet. Meanwhile, the paladin has followed in their footsteps. She has caught up to them, and is helping the nomad climb down from the building that they arrived at. Of course, at this point they recognize the dragon is about to do something, and she drags him into safety. The hunter realizes that he had forgotten something, and he puts a hand into his pouch, realizing that there is a crown of jagged steel there. It is wound in shredded bandages. As he pulls it up, he and all the others collectively realize. They remember for a moment why they'd come there to begin with. This memory is stronger than the others. Each of them remember that whatever their original reason for coming here was, it was a promise made by a man. A man who is a mysterious individual that, even though they do not remember him, they remember that he, as the Lord of Return, could grant them whatever they desired. Be it peace, a cure, simply money. As they realize this, they realize that he had tasked them with bringing this crown to the structure and to deliver it to the throne. All but one, for the paladin remembers something separate. She remembers being in a council of elves with violent voices and hard demeanors. A war council, appointing her as the one who would spearhead an expedition to reclaim a powerful and cursed artifact before it could reach one known as the Hollow Lord or the Lord of Hollows. She has come here to oppose them, and as she realizes this, she immediately grabs her blade, and even though she does feel guilt at this course of action, she drives the blade into the nomad. He cannot defend himself, having only one arm and a bad leg. The blade strikes true and the nomad slumps to the ground, life leaving his body. The dragon stares at them all, having realized that they have realized something. The knight, having also fallen before and lost part of his divinity, has forgotten what exactly ails the person he seeks to cure. But he recognizes that whatever this being is, whatever it promises, it is of evil, and he will take no part in it. He steps back, lifts a pistol, and shoots the hunter, who falls to the ground and loses grasp of the crown. The hunter lies there bleeding, the crafter next to him, the mage down on the ground in front of the dragon, and the paladin with a blade embedded in the nomad. And he still serves, because he still wants the vengeance promised to him by this stranger, this Lord of our Return. Pointing his pistol at the dragon, he fires a bullet, and it takes off a single scale of the massive being. Anchored by this action, it fires a glob of black and oozing oil. Except it is no oil. It is something far worse, and it splashes upon him, and it splashes around the knight and around the crafter. The force of impact sends the crafter flying into the air, but she uses this to fall upon the knight, for the crafter still serves the Lord of our Return, for he is the one who pays her, and without money she cannot stay alive. She lands, slamming her hammer into the knight, but the impact on her legs and on her torso kills her in that moment, and she buckles over, the knight wounded but still standing. He manages to climb his way back onto the building where the hunter is lying, the crown in his hand. With his final resolve, the knight swings his mace upon the crown, seeking to destroy it, though the crown will not easily be destroyed, and it shears through the mace, cutting off pieces. The steel breaks, and the knight dies. Corruption takes his soul, and the Hollow Lord does not deign to resurrect him, because the knight has opposed his desire, his commandment. Meanwhile, the mage casts a spell. She calls the crown to her hand, for she still seeks to deliver it. Her quest is not complete. However, the paladin is still on ground, and she moves up next to the mage, swinging her blade at her, but narrowly missing. Sensing that failure may be imminent, the Hollow Lord calls upon one last resurrection for the hunter, the knight, the nomad, and the crafter. This time they will not return as their own. They will return as his servants, his eternal servants. As they rise, they fall upon the elf with their wicked blades, driving her back. They almost manage to kill her, but in her final moment she manages to push herself up, delivering another blow towards the mage. For a moment it appears to be working, that the blade will strike true, but the mage slips to the side, and it merely skitters over her collarbone, opening skin, but without drawing enough blood to be lethal. In that moment the two of them lock eyes, and corruption grasps their hearts. They die, then and there, both of their missions unfulfilled. But they are in the land of the Hollows, and their binding to divinity is lost. So the Hollow Lord has but to command them, "Stand, arise, serve me." And they do. And together, those 6 travel beneath the structure into the darkness beyond the endless corridor, the endless downwards going staircase, beyond where the green light and the red light and any light hits. And there they find a hallway, and at the end of it a throne. There is no one upon this throne, it is empty. But it that was formerly known as the Mage steps forward and lays down the crown upon this throne. A being starts to emerge, drawing power from the hollow within. The Hollow Lord returns, his army of Inane awaiting, his 6 new servants ready to take on the world, pawns in his gambit to destroy the world, once and for all. The cycle must go on.